Beloved in Christ, my name is Father Deacon Joseph. I serve at St. Armand of Alaska Church in Stafford, Virginia. We were blessed to purchase property 2 years ago, and now we are in the process of raising funds. We have an architect here designing a temple to God's glory. Please, if you can, donate to our effort. Thank you, and God bless. Amen.
Zwingli is the topic for tonight. Zwingli and then the Anabaptists. But first, what I want to talk about is a little kind of contextualization of this stuff. You had Luther, who was the first of the major reformers. Starting in 1517 with nailing the theses to the door of the church, and all of that kind of that began in there, and then it became more and more and more like a kind of a tidal wave as people rebelled against the Roman Catholic Church. And they rebelled against not only the church, but they also were rebelling against the authority structure of the papacy. Now, there is no question that the Western Church became deeply, deeply corrupt during the first half of the second millennium, and actually, the Western Church was probably already pretty far on the way to corruption in the last half of the first millennium. The corruption has been within the church forever. Remember, Judas was one of the 12 apostles, Peter betrayed Jesus, and so on and so forth. So corruption has always been in the church. If you think that there's going to be a church without corruption, you're fooling yourself. So, thank you very much. But some of that corruption was moral corruption. You had the whole problem of an enforced celibacy. Now, the Roman Church from the first century on, the Church of the City of Rome, had always had this rule that the clergy had to be celibate, and that's just a very, very ancient practice, local practice. It was never a universal practice. However, there was always a reticence on the part of the church to validate any kind of carnal union with celebration of the divine mysteries. And so, there have been various permutations of that. Initially, bishops were married, but the bishops were simply the main pastors of the church in the earliest church. Later on, you had a problem with bishops being married, in that they wanted to some of them wanted to pass down the title to the property of the diocese to their sons, or even to their nephews and things like that. And that was a big problem. In the West, it became a huge issue, and it was called the investiture controversy. So that was one of the major things that spurred the rule of clerical celibacy. And of course, in the Eastern Church, what happened is at first bishops had to put away their wives. So they would split from their wives, and their wives would either go and live in convents, or they would do something else, and the bishop would take monastic vows, but they lived separately. And that's not something that's alien. It's not common, but it's practiced even now. When I went to Georgia, I met Archbishop Dimitri, who was the nephew of the patriarch, and Archbishop Dimitri took me to meet his wife and children. He was the Archbishop of Batumi, The patriarch, who was his uncle, had asked him to separate from his wife and be the bishop there. And so he had his wife and kids very involved in the church and very involved in the diocese, but not living together, and no conjugal visits. Very odd. And there's quite a number of bishops in the Georgian church where that has that happened recently. However, the more normal attitude in the contemporary Orthodox Church, if a bishop has a, shall we say, illicit union, illicit marriage, is what happened to Filaret in Kiev, and that means he's defrocked for breaking his monastic vows and for breaking his obedience to the church. So there's always been this, and there are canons that a priest should not have any carnal relations with his wife before celebrating the Eucharist, there's also a canon that both the priest and his wife, before their marriage, have to be both virgins. As they say, there's never been a canonical ordination. Yeah, seriously though. And that's so there's always been this issue in the medieval West. The Roman Church tolerated married clergy for centuries, but then it was like the 12th or the 13th century when they began to really crack down. Well, the Germans did not appreciate that. Yeah.
Can you just back up a little bit and say like when the kind of celibate bishops became like a common practice or like implemented?
Well, in the Latin Church, that's from apostolic times. In the Eastern Church, I think it's okay. I think it's in the 6th century that became the norm. It's not, and then because the bishop had to become a monk or be a monk. Now that's not always observed. Like most Greek and Antiochian bishops are only dressed up. They're not monks. If you have a hat with a veil, that means you're a monk. But Greeks and Antiochians, they just dress them all up, and the Slavic churches don't agree with that.
They don't get the monastic tonsure?
Nope.
Wow.
Sometimes they're Rosaphores, but very often they're not. So the Russian church is much stricter about that. Of course, there's a whole, I could go on and describe all of that. So really, by the 7th century, it was within the canons. It was in the canons of Trullo, which is a council between the 6th and the 7th council. In the West, though, the Germans never quite accepted the papal mandate for celibacy, just like they also didn't like the fasting rules. The Germans never got accustomed to not drinking milk and the dairy fast, whereas in the Mediterranean that was a normal thing. And there's other local cultural variations. So this was one of the things that fed into, if you remember, the rebelliousness of the German princedoms against the papacy. There was this whole controversy in the 13th, 14th centuries called the conciliarist controversy. And you had the Germans and the Swiss and probably the Franks. Franks are German, by the way. Germans who speak bad Latin with a funny accent. But the Franks, and in fact in Greece, a Roman Catholic priest is called Frango Papa, right?
Yeah.
Frango Papa.
One fact, the word frangos, frank, is a generic term for any Western European, and it's not a compliment.
No. No. So the okay. Where was I?
Franks.
So you had you had the French, the Franks, the Germans, the Holy Roman Empire, the Swiss Confederation, and other North Europeans who were in opposition to the papacy, and the papacy was pushing for the absolute authority of the papacy, just kind of like Bartholomew now, and the rest of the church in the North was saying, no, this is not the Catholic tradition. This is not the Orthodox tradition. This is not the ancient tradition, and so there was this conflict going on between the papacy, which alternated between Italy and France, Avignon, and the Germans. Well, there were a series of councils, and it was basically a stalemate. The Council of Florence, which was a reunion council in 1438, which is where the Patriarchate of Constantinople was desperately pleading for a crusade to come and save them from the Turks, so they went to this council, but they sided with the papacy as opposed to the conciliarists. They probably would have done better with the conciliarists because the papacy didn't do anything. And 15 years later, Constantinople fell to the Turks. There continued to be unrest in Europe. Remember, this was also the time of the Inquisition. This was a time when the mystics of the church were being persecuted, not only in Spain, but also in Germany. This was a time when you had the initial movements towards rebellion. You had the Hussites. You had Wycliffe. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. So things were this kind of Renaissance. Europe was not necessarily a peaceful time. Plus, you had the whole philosophical movement of scholasticism, which was really maturing at that time. One could say that the high point of it was in the 13th century with Thomas Aquinas, but what happened over those succeeding centuries, as Western Europe progressed through the Renaissance, is that the universities strengthened, the cities strengthened. About the year 1000, London, Paris, Frankfurt, whatever, the major Western cities were still little villages of 10,000 people. I mean, there was literally nothing major of any kind of major urban center in the West. 500 years later, these major urban centers had begun to develop, and there were huge populations, and relatively speaking, and the development of the universities also meant the development of scholastic theology, in other words, academic work. And so the level of education in Western Europe, at least among the elite, was growing substantially. And so another thing that was growing substantially were the tastes in architecture and in fine goods. And so if you go to the museum, I strongly advise going up to I don't know if it's open, but the Metropolitan Museum in New York and the cloisters, which is their medieval section and all. It shows you there was some incredibly rich cultural expressions during this whole period. Well, a lot of that took money. It took a lot, and it took a lot of money. And so this was the context for the development of the what do you call it? That Luther railed against. Indulgences, sorry. And then all of that money flowing in created a context of corruption. So there was moral corruption, there was financial corruption, there was corruption of power, because as the papacy grew in power, the bishops grew in power. The papacy was kind of like was more of an imperial power than it was just a bishop, the Bishop of Rome, and so that in itself created huge problems. And the indulgences which were being collected were to pay for St. Peter's. Now, think of how much St. Peter's cost. You know, it's the largest church in the world still. And you know how much, and people were poor. You know, think of. I mean, on a fiscal base, you know, how do you generate that kind of money in the Middle Ages? So there were all these various opportunities and areas where corruption was rampant in society. One of Luther's things was about, you know, stopping some of the corruption. You know, especially with the indulgences, that was about stopping corruption. But then, in addition to that, there were other areas that had become exaggerated piety, and ways of using the church to manipulate people, to get money out of them, to get whatever they wanted out of them. There was also collusion between the church and the state. And sometimes it wasn't clear who was coming out on top. Because in the West, what you had was ultimately a church state. You know, the church and the state were a unified whole. At least in Byzantium, it was a two-headed eagle. Usually the one head bit off the other, and the church was usually the loser. But there was still nominally a dual system, whereas in the West it really was not. And so this created a whole context for problems. One of the major philosophical movements that happened in the West during this period was nominalism. And that essentially broke the connection between what an object or a concept or something symbolized and its archetype, its fundamental reality. So, in other words, in the ancient church, in the patristic era, if you had something that was a symbol, it meant you were throwing two realities together. Symboli means thrown together. So that by participating in the one, you participated in the other. So you could literally say in the first millennium that the bread and the wine of the Eucharist is a symbol of the body and blood of Christ. Now, that would make you sound like a Protestant. But that was an Orthodox term because the word symbol at the time meant that by partaking of the of the type, you partook of the archetype. When that connection broke, that shattered a whole lot of other fundamental connections, both in relation to spirituality, as in relation to sacramental theology, and one of the things that we can see in this process of the Reformation is the beginning of a radical secularization. You know what I mean by secularization? Okay, secularism has a number of different layers of meaning. We usually think about it in terms of keeping the church and state separate, right? That there's the religious realm over here, and there's the state realm over here, or there's the religious realm over here, and there's daily life over here, and what you do in church stays in church, and what you do at home stays at home. What you do in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? Supposedly, but it doesn't, obviously. So one of the things that secularism means is compartmentalization. And so it's that compartmentalization of the religious from daily life. It's the compartmentalization of the church from the state. Now, one of the things that we see in the beginning of the Reformation is this struggle of working out secularization, because for whatever, no matter how corrupt it was, no matter how messed up it was, the papal church in the first 1500 years still was a completely integrated understanding of Christianity. That's one of the great strengths of Orthodoxy. We're a totally integrated understanding of Christianity. Your religious life, your spiritual life, your work life, your family life, your recreation, everything has a spiritual aspect. Every aspect of life is sanctified by your faith in Christ, right? And you should be, and everything that we do has an impact on our spiritual life. So, if you're a businessman and you're cheating and stealing and all of that, not only does that mean you have to go to confession, but what are you doing? You're messing up your soul. And you're messing up your relationships with other people, and so all of these things have consequences. That integration of spirituality and daily life is one of the hallmarks of Orthodoxy that makes it different from Western Christianity. Because Western Christianity has capitulated entirely to secularism. Now, with Luther, that we talked about pretty extensively, right, for a couple weeks, with Luther you saw the beginnings of a secular revolt against the papacy. I mean, you had other themes too. You had the rejection of the supremacy of the papacy. But Luther tended to throw the baby out with the bathwater. He not only got rid of the popes, but he got rid of the bishops, and thereby impugned the apostolicity of the church, of his church. He still believed in the real presence, but it was only vaguely connected with the bread of the Eucharist and the wine of the Eucharist. Although he did say they should be given together and not separately, the Roman Catholic Church was giving the bread and the wine of the Eucharist only to the priests, and the faithful would only receive the body of Christ, and various other things. The insistence on marriage. Luther rejected celibacy. He rejected monasticism. Monasticism is the ultimate expression of a radically integrated spiritual life, of a whole life lived in terms of spiritual, of your spiritual life and of your religious life, and so that's when in monasticism it talks about the renunciation of the world. The word in Latin for the world is secula. Okay? You renounce secular life. In other words, you renounce a life that is compartmentalized and disintegrated, in order to live a life that is completely integrated around around faith and around our commitment to Christ. The rejection of that was a radical step on the way towards the secularization of religion, and the secularization of the church and its role within society. Luther renounced his monastic vows. He was a Catholic priest, renounced his vows, and married a nun, consummating the marriage 2 weeks before they got married. And so, fornication on top of that, with a nun, no less. And so, so it was this total rejection of a life lived that was consecrated to God. Yeah.
I didn't know about the fornication. Did he try to justify this doctrinally, or did he just say it's a mistake?
I don't think he said it was a mistake.
So what was
I don't know.
justification
I don't
for
know.
fornication?
I don't know.
That they weren't actually married at that point, because they said they were married.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was.
Well, Luther rejected marriage as a sacrament.
Right.
So what's marriage then?
Well, yeah, of course.
Yeah. It's just, yeah. And so within this already are the roots of a lot of the things that have, over the past 500 years, have come to fruition in our culture. Yeah.
I was just going to say, thinking about all of this detail of Luther's life makes me almost imagine what he would have been like in real life. And it certainly sounds like an interesting individual I would never want to associate with.
Mm-hmm.
And just a radical, what we would define today as liberal.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and so if I think about it in that context, I'm like, well, no wonder his church has gone on too, because it was started that way.
Mm-hmm. But Luther's reform was probably, in some ways, it was the mildest of the reforms.
Yeah.
Correct.
The Anglicans, with Anglican comprehensiveness, and they essentially they really didn't emphasize any doctrine. You could believe whatever you want, kind of do whatever you want. It's the big umbrella that takes everybody in, so long as you're the subject of the king, and we'll use the Book of Common Prayer, you're an Anglican. But then when you get to Zwingli, and then into Calvin, you get even more radical reforms than Luther. And it's interesting, rereading this. Zwingli laid the foundations for the Anabaptist movement. The Anabaptist movement was a radical rejection of even the Reformed churches, which they believed didn't go far enough. And so, but not only were they a rejection of Roman Catholicism and the Reformed churches, you have to look and see that ultimately what they were doing is they threw out the apostolic tradition. And so really you get too much past Lutheranism and some strains within Anglicanism. There's very little left of the apostolic tradition. So I would encourage people to read the section on Zwingli. But I thought it might be interesting to go over a few things. One of the interesting things about this is that Luther, of course, was German, but Zwingli was Swiss. The Holy Roman Empire, the great oxymoron, was definitely had its own kind of ideology about it. It was, but the Swiss, who also were a cantankerous bunch, fighting with one another over all sorts of things, and then all the cultural differences between the German speakers and the French speakers, and I presume later the Italian speakers, all within Switzerland. They brought a kind of a different cultural emphasis on things, and then Calvin came from Geneva, also Switzerland, but French-speaking Switzerland. So you have these very different European cultures manifesting themselves through the Reformation. Later, the Dutch would play a huge role. Now, this thing that was sent out was the canons of Dort, which essentially enshrined Calvin's theology and interestingly the justifications for it. Yeah.
How much difference is there between Zwingli and Calvin?
There's a lot, and in fact, what this was, it was a set of refutations of Zwingli
From Calvin?
from the Calvinists.
Calvinists, okay.
Yeah, Zwingli was killed fairly early on, but his theology had a big impact, and especially among the Anabaptists. Now, the Anabaptists, the hallmark of the Anabaptist movement is that they rejected infant baptism. And so they said that infant baptism was from the devil, it was a papal invention, and all sorts of other nonsense. Basically it was all about ignorance,
I thought Anabaptists rejected baptism altogether.
No.
Make the Baptist again, be baptized
Yeah, it
again.
means to be rebaptized.
Okay.
And so they would rebaptize people who had been baptized as infants. Yeah.
It has to do with the age of reason, right? Where it's like
Right.
They don't think that sacraments are valid unless you understand them.
Well, except they also got rid of the idea of sacrament.
Baptism considered a sacrament?
Yeah, what is sacraments?
But if there's no sacraments, then what are you really doing when you're wedding a child? You're doing nothing. That's why it's really just a public profession of faith.
Right.
So, of course, well, why would you do that with your infant?
It's
Why
a
you
sign of faith.
dedicate your child and then
Right.
have them get baptized when they know?
In fact, the Baptists, at least currently, they call them ordinances because they were ordained by the Lord, baptism and Eucharist, but they don't ascribe any spiritual effect to baptism or to the Eucharist. Yeah.
Would you describe this as Gnosticism at this point? Because it's basically like you acquire a certain kind of gnosis, and that's your salvation.
Yeah.
It seems like
Well,
kind of a stretch.
it is a kind of a Gnosticism because it's dualistic also.
Oh.
the fundamental Orthodox precept is that God was incarnate and he filled matter with divinity. In other words, matter can become a vessel of grace. So not only the bread and the wine of the Eucharist, the oil of chrism, and the water of baptism are vessels of grace, but our very bodies become vessels of grace. And the point of the sacraments is not so much that the bread and the wine of the Eucharist becomes the body of Christ, and the water becomes the means of becoming part of the body of Christ. The whole point is that we become the body of Christ. And it's all about deification. It's all about theosis, and the complete sanctification and permeation of our very physical being with grace. And so everything in the Orthodox understanding proceeds from that fundamental assertion. The whole understanding of the saints, for example, what salvation is, for Baptists, at least currently, it's about going to heaven. Well, what does that mean? For us, salvation means being deified, and it means now, here, at this moment, and in the process of purification and the process of sanctification, and of illumination, enlightenment. So, but because that integration between the material and the spiritual was lost, there were a whole lot of other things that fundamentally suffered. And what is that? It's compartmentalization. It's secularization. And so the Protestant Reformation became the foundation of the secularism of the West, and of its compartmentalization and the gradual boxing in and now reduction, especially in socialist and Marxist thought, which is the most radically and toxic kind of secularism, so that it no longer can exist.
Well, to start by reducing Christianity to an ideology, if
Right.
something goes on in your brain,
Mhm.
then other ideas can
Right.
carry on.
Right.
And then the other idea is one.
Can carry you start with Christianity being nothing that goes on in your brain, then whatever other ideas occur to you about the world can just occupy the same space.
Right. It's also in other words, it's radically materialistic, ultimately. You've got the material and the spiritual. And if salvation is going to sit on a cloud with a harp in heaven, like the Roman pagan religion, which is where that comes from, actually. That has nothing to do with the resurrection of the body. Of course, how big is the idea of the resurrection of the body in Western Christianity?
Not that big.
It's yeah. I mean, it's a reduction of salvation to
Get out of hell free card, basically.
well, yeah, and have your personal relationship with Jesus. That's a 19th, 20th century formula, but it's that total reduction of the deification of our total being in the context of the whole church. And there's another aspect of this too, and that's the privatization of religion, which is a radical thing. Orthodoxy is completely different than that. We're collectivist. Our whole idea is collectivist. In other words, your salvation depends on my salvation, and his salvation depends on his salvation, and so on and so forth. We're saved together as the body of Christ, and not just individually. It's not just me and Jesus. It's about us and Jesus in God. Yeah.
So One of the things is that didn't sit right with me when I was first exposed to Orthodoxy is that the West does recite that they believe in the resurrection of the body in the Apostles' Creed, which is not used in Orthodoxy. So there's
Right.
at least a shadow of the idea there.
Yeah, well, formally they do.
Right.
Now, the Lutherans do. God only knows what the Anglicans do.
What they want.
The Presbyterians probably do, I think. Does anybody?
They just don't think about it.
They don't think about it. It's
Well,
yeah.
Lutherans
They,
don't think
they
about it
say
anymore.
it, but they don't really work it out.
Yeah, it's not a big. It's not a big theme.
Yeah.
Whereas for us, it's the whole. Who hasn't been to Pascha yet? Oh
Man.
yeah,
You got to do all of Holy Week, though. Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, it's time to start planning so you can take off Holy Week, so that you can be at all the services,
Worth it.
which is 6 hours of services a day up until Thursday, and when it's 8 to 10 hours a day. Okay, so start planning now. Get those hours in to your supervisor.
I've been to the pool. Ladika.
Yeah.
I noticed in that thing you ignored, that there was, I don't know what it was, something you ignored, is that there were 5 sections, and the last section was perseverance. Does this correspond to the tulip?
Yeah, this was tulip.
Total depravity? et
Yeah.
cetera?
This is the original form of tulip. So.
Can we call them revolutionaries and not reformers? Because I feel like reformers is too generous.
Well, I usually call it the deformation,
Yeah.
you know. Yeah.
So going back to the dualistic tendency within Protestantism, this is something that I started noticing when I was at least kind of making my way towards Catholicism before I started coming towards Orthodoxy, was this dualism.
Mhm.
But then kind of getting more into the difference between penal substitution, basically what's adopted as the gospel within most of modern Protestantism. Penal substitution basically is the gospel for most of them. This seems to me to be, and I'm just asking you to affirm or deny what I'm saying, but it seems to fit in well with the dualistic and
Sure.
secularistic tendency, because in Orthodoxy, of course, if you have the resurrection of the body and you have the deification of the person, the perfection of the person, and the transformation of the person is the gospel.
Right.
The total transformation of the person. Whereas penal substitution is like, oh, well, Jesus, or God's going to look at, the Father's going to look at Jesus, and then you don't necessarily have to totally transform yourself, but you can just get off free.
Right.
Do you see kind of the same thing that I do in there? And do you think that this attitude of dualism and secularism basically gives rise to penal substitution becoming the most prominent version of the gospel within modern Protestantism?
Well, you've got to also remember that it's combined with the rest of tulip, which is not only total depravity, but universal double predestination. And the limited atonement. So that everybody is born, deserves to be damned, period. But God has chosen some that he's elected them, not on their own merits and not based on foreknowledge of his own merits, but randomly, and it's those people that Christ died for, and not anybody else. And he died to save them from. Jesus died to save people from God.
Aren't the seeds already planted for this in the overemphasis on justification, starting with Anselm? I mean, it was already in Roman Catholicism where they were not so much concerned about sanctification as they were about justification,
Right.
and being pronounced legally righteous.
Right.
Yeah, that
Right.
attitude is kind of what I'm thinking
Yeah.
about.
Exactly.
That goes with that secular.
Right.
And he took out all the things.
Yeah, that God took out all of his anger on his son.
Yeah.
There was a-
happy and fluffy and nice.
Well, it's not a Trinitarian God. That's what
Right.
always pushed me away. It splits the Trinity. And the other thing I was going to push back, Fadiga, is when you said randomly, I think that's even too generous because they say for his own glory, which is even more confusing. Like that he chooses some for his own glory and some not. It's like randomly would be a kinder act.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't there something in Aquinas about the saved in heaven actually enjoying the torment, seeing the torment of people in hell, because they're exulting in God's justice by seeing the damned
That's
being
Edwards.
tormented forever.
You know,
Have you ever heard that?
That's Edwards is 500 years later.
Yeah.
I'm beginning to wonder, I'm not sure if it said this in the book, I don't think it did, but I'm wondering what John Calvin's relationship was like with his own earthly father.
Well, my personal opinion is that John Calvin was a sick dude with a bad relationship with his father.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. at this
Well,
point.
if you can't trust a French lawyer, who can you trust?
Yeah. part of the thing with the whole the forensic model, which is the penal substitutionary theory, and most of Western thought is a forensic model. It's a model of that there's of an exchange of a contract, essentially, and it doesn't have the freedom of relationship that Eastern thought does. It's a totally different way of thinking about things.
I think it was Roger Scruton, who was a conservative philosopher. I think he at one point drew a connection between personal property rights and the Protestant models of salvation, which was very interesting. Just basically saying that.
Yeah. There's a really interesting book that I think it's from the 30s or the 40s, Max Weber, A Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism.
Oh,
I read that.
Yeah, excellent book.
It was.
Yeah. The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism.
I mean, in a sense, we have to hand it to them in a sense that if you want to build a working secular society that builds prosperity and material, they do that better than Orthodox societies do.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's where they put, that's their religion in a sense.
Right.
Their religion is avarice.
Prosperity, yeah.
I think a big idea of Calvinism, a lot of these Anabaptists and stuff, and even the Pilgrims, where it was basically like you can see like God likes these people more because He gives them all these earthly things.
Well, and so that leads you to the prosperity gospel and other nonsense.
Yeah, and that's one reason they look at Orthodox societies as, quote, backward, because we don't develop this big material culture in the same way that they do.
But, a lot of the motivation for some of that, at least at various times historically, especially with the Calvinists, is you had to prove your election. And the way that you proved your election was that everything would go well. You had the beautiful wife, you had the beautiful house, you had everything went well. You were wealthy, you were happy, and all of this stuff, and you knew that everything you were doing was the will of God. And
Well, that's a lot, now with prosperity.
it's a lot, yeah, but it's divorced from its earlier roots. And so, what we have now, at the time of Calvin and Luther, there were not hundreds of denominations. There were 3 or 4. There were the Calvinists. There was the Roman Church. There was the Lutherans, the Calvinists, and the Anabaptists.
And of course, depending where you lived, there was probably just one.
Or there were the Reforms,
Lutheran,
the Anabaptists, and the Roman Catholics.
But
Yeah.
they were all fighting for control of territory that they would be the exclusive religion in that territory.
Right.
Which is what the 30 Years' War was.
Yeah.
If you reject bishops, where did that leave Luther's ecclesiology?
Well, outside it's not congregationalist
There are Lutheran
precisely.
bishops. There are Lutheran
Well,
bishops.
they're nominal Lutheran bishops, but they don't have any sense of apostolic succession. And the Swedish ladies do, but nobody else, kind of can be nice and patronizing and, pat them on the, I don't know what's safe to pat them on. Say that.
When you mean the ladies, you mean the female bishops or the
Yeah.
male bishops that are,
Yeah, the female bishops.
okay.
They're mostly female.
Yeah.
So anyway, what I wanted to do tonight briefly is look at some of these. Zwingli wrote a series of theses, or kind of, I don't know if you could call it a confession, but Zwingli didn't think Luther was radical enough. And one of the biggest issues with Zwingli was the authority of the clergy. And so basically with Zwingli, what he did was he elevated the civic officials to the same level as bishops and priests when it came to decision making within the church. So that the division between church and this is part of this struggle between secularism, with secularism and how do you have an integrated society on one hand, on the other hand, which I think remained an ideal. On the other hand, there was this secular movement. So we would call it radically secularist to get rid of clerics as decision makers within the church and just have the appointed civic officials. And that's a pretty weird thing. The 67 Theses, let's see, says there was a great council of Zurich and 2 disputations in 1523, in which Zwingli's opponents were allowed to debate him. In the first, some 600 people gathered together to judge charges against Zwingli, and no one could prove him guilty of heresy. For this reason, Zwingli hastily drew up his 67 Theses, which were essentially gleaned from his sermons of preceding years. So here is a selection of these theses. Those who say the gospel is invalid without the confirmation of the church err and slander God. Now that's packed. Those who say the gospel is invalid without the confirmation of the church err and slander God. In the first place, you've got this idea that the gospel, the New Testament, exists independent of the church, which is a patent fallacy. Since the church wrote the gospel, the church edited the gospel, and the church published the gospel, and the gospel is a liturgical book of the church. And quite frankly, outside of the liturgical life of the church, it's incomprehensible. It's also incomprehensible outside of the tradition of interpretation. So a lot of these became the kind of roots of later Protestantism, where you have this profoundly ignorant arrogant, ignorant idea that that people can interpret the gospel for themselves, and that it exists outside of the context of the interpretation of the church. So, along with these things, he completely dismissed all tradition of the church, all the patristic writings, all of the councils, all of the dogmas, all of the doctrines. Only sola scriptura, and in the most radical way. Luther did not go that far at all. Luther still maintained that it was critical to have that entire context of interpretation, and the interpretation of the scriptures should be in line with the early church. What he was opposed to was the distortion of that had happened over the previous 500 years.
It took me a second when you started reading to get past the part where he said that he wrote these 67 theses based on sermons that he already gave.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. No, this, quite frankly, you know,
I don't.
yeah, I mean, you're dealing. What are we dealing with these guys? I mean, these are radical egotists,
Yes.
right? And it's radical egotism. You know, could you imagine the kind of ego it would take to go out and try and reform the Roman Catholic Church? It's like we're trying to reform the Orthodox Church. I mean, trying to reform a parish. You know,
It's an amazing paradox too. You know, they attack the Pope for being, you know, this big authority, but then they mimic it themselves, become their own Pope. And the Anabaptists drop the whole apostolic tradition, and then they proclaim themselves apostles and prophets and all sorts of crazy
Right.
stuff. Why wasn't this obvious to people? Saying, wait a minute, you're doing exactly the thing you accuse those guys of.
right?
I mean, why? How did this get that far?
It did because of the combination of state power.
Yeah.
Why are we all wearing masks in stores?
That's right.
It's the same thing.
Not us there.
Okay, number 15 was, all truth is clear in him. Well,
In who?
in Christ, obviously.
Right.
All truth is clear in him. Now, that's a pretty problematic statement. It means that everybody, and it ultimately results in, later on, this assertion that each person can understand the scriptures for themselves. Because it's self-evident. That's why there are 70,000 Protestant denominations.
If it's clear, why would you have to say it?
Good question.
What do they? I mean, what's the answer to the Ethiopian eunuch? I mean, asking how.
That's what I always bring up too.
Yeah.
Right. How can I understand this unless someone explains it to me?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's what I brought up to.
Because I mean, when you really think about it, if you read the Bible, you can really get anything you want out of it without proper guidance. You can be like, oh, this means that, this means that.
I don't want to sound like a social justice warrior, but I think to try to answer that question, it's a bit of a colonial attitude towards other people. I mean, that's what I've experienced, is that, oh, that poor Ethiopian didn't understand.
Seriously?
No, yeah, really.
But he was reading himself, I mean, he was reading, first of all, he was literate, which wasn't.
And rich. Yeah.
He was apparently an official, he was somebody of substance.
These are all things
was
that
a
aren't-
very high person
How
of
can you know
substance.
that? That's not in the Bible.
The Ethiopians were never colonized.
I'm saying that's what
Well,
the
yeah,
apostles
I mean,
say. Like, how can
current.
you know that he's noble? Or he's a noble?
Because he was riding in a chariot. I mean,
Yeah.
have chariot
Yeah,
dealerships.
Yeah, he was riding in the chariot, not pulling it.
As long as it's their narrative that it's something that's extra biblical.
Yeah.
It's,
Now, this is in the text.
No, but I think there's a Darwinian aspect.
So this is number 16. Human doctrines and decrees are useless for salvation. In other words, anything that's not in the Bible is useless for salvation. 17. Christ is the only high priest, and all who have called themselves high priests have completely rejected him. No.
Why does it use the word only?
Yeah, I
Well,
mean, Christ is the great high priest.
Christ is the great high priest, of course, but not all people who are high priests. The word bishop means hierarch, archiere, high priest. Have rejected him? I don't think so.
It's reductionist.
No, but they're deriving their priesthood from
Right.
Christ.
It's his priesthood.
It's his priesthood,
Christ sacrificed himself once for all. So it follows that the Mass is not a sacrifice, but a commemoration of Christ's sacrifice. Okay, you see, now you've got this separation. Okay, between the type and the antitype.
But again, doesn't that already start in extent with Roman Catholicism, where they see the Mass not so much as participating, are participating here and now in Christ's sacrifice, But they're re-sacrificing Christ again on the altar. That's where you get the bleeding hosts and
Yeah,
things
yeah,
like
yeah,
that. You know
yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah, we have, the Orthodox have plenty of that stuff. too.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, unfortunately, there's bad, toxic piety is not, they have no monopoly on it. But I think the most important thing is you've got this radical separation between the type and the antitype.
Yeah,
Christians only have to obey God, and fasting rules are a Roman imposture. In other words, you only have to obey what's in the scriptures, and you don't have to do anything else.
Like when Christ says, when you fast.
Like
Yeah.
this, right? So,
When you choose to fast.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
and so it's what it is. It's a total rebellion against the not only the corruption that's in the church, but the essential discipline that has been passed on from apostolic times, and the whole understanding of how to be a Christian. It says time and place are not binding either. I'm not sure what that means. 26, vestments, tonsures, etc. are hypocrisy.
Anything else?
No, these are just short little. That's all his theses words. They're little
Oh, zingers.
one-liners. So he, in other words, okay, in the liturgy, the whole, you have vestments in the Old Testament, you have vestments in the Book of Revelation, you have, and the whole idea of worship is participation in the heavenly liturgy, of which the earthly liturgy is a type. So there's a radical abandonment of that. There's an abandonment of priesthood, there's an abandonment of typology, there's an abandonment of sacramental reality. In other words, it's not Christianity. It's a different religion. And so in modern Anabaptist movement, Mennonites, Amish, and all of that, you don't have any vestments in the church. You don't have liturgies, you don't have the Eucharist, you don't have...
So is there something to be said about the extremely apparent decay in most of the Protestant sects, except for the Anabaptists and their schisms? Because the Amish are, put simply, a lot more well-behaved.
Decent folk.
Yeah, and
Very
even
conservative in their way.
and even the Mennonites are
Right.
they're fine people.
Yeah, they are. They're strongly self-enclosed sects. And you could say the same thing about the Orthodox, except for the Greeks, maybe.
Why are you looking at me?
Because you're the local expert.
I'm the Greek, right?
You're the local expert. But seriously, Orthodox churches, for the most part, it's an ethnic minority, and they're with very strong boundaries on the community.
Well,
We're trying to
Greeks
buck
are
that
like that
trend
too.
too. So
What's that?
We're trying to buck that trend here.
We're trying really hard. This is not this is not to say that anybody in these groups are bad. I mean, some of their leaders, like these guys, they're pretty problematic. But this is not to say that the faithful people are bad or not faithful Christians.
Right. It's just with the Amish, it's really apparent that they're cool.
Yeah, it's a very insular, self-enclosed community with very strong boundaries. Orthodoxy has strong boundaries. Protestantism, modern Roman Catholicism has almost no boundaries. Anabaptists are by definition what a sect is. Amish is a sect. Mennonites are a sect. And what it is, it's a minority religion that has no pretension to be Catholic. Not Roman Catholic, but it doesn't have a Catholic understanding that this is the faith for everyone. This is for our group.
Or would you say that Zwingli was the most influential out of all of the Protestant reformers in the modern age? Say like the evangelicals and
Probably, yeah. And it's interesting that so much of Calvinism developed in opposition to Zwingli. Because in Protestantism, you've got,
What's the synthesis? Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis.
well, some of, I mean, if you really want to be Hegelian, I don't see how, but I mean, really, there's several major schools of Protestantism. There's the Lutherans, and that's kind of a thing in and of itself. There's the Anglicans, God only knows. You know, and most of the mainline Protestant groups have lost their identity, their historical, doctrinal identity.
Their football teams.
Yeah, but there were these very highly defined traditions. You know, Anabaptist was a very highly defined tradition. The Calvinists, was a very highly defined tradition. The Methodist was a very highly defined tradition with its own unique whole history of interpretation of the scriptures, and you know, and whereas contrast that to say a free church evangelicalism, which is literally make it up as you go, pick and choose from, you know, from whatever the pastor feels like at the moment.
Anderson,
Yeah, and it literally has no historical roots, even in these Protestant traditions that only go back to the 15th or 16th century.
When a lot of Baptists, for example, have Calvinist theology.
Right.
You know, back to the Amish and Mennonites, as you said, you know, that they don't have any Catholic understanding at all. In a way, they're kind of like more communities than a confession, kind of like a Christian version of a Jewish Hasidic sect or
Right.
something. You know?
Right,
It's
exactly.
a community that really is their focus, not a religious doctrine per se.
Right. Although I think they're pretty strict in their doctrine.
Oh, they are. So are Hasidic Jews. I mean, they're all very tight in their little community.
Right.
They kind of look the same in a way. Some
Yeah, I was about to
Yeah,
say
they do.
with the black,
Yeah, and the long gray beards, you know.
Well, they're not-
kind of like Ashkenazi Jews.
When they don't have a Catholic understanding, that allows for like severe ethnocentrism, which is always good for the longevity of a group.
Mm-hmm.
What does Pastor Steve Anderson call his dad? His mom's husband.
Oh.
You can't call him father.
Can't father.
So it's here's my mother's husband.
Wait, that's not.
Wait.
That's legit.
No, it's a
Oh,
joke.
okay.
He used the verse like don't call anyone on her father. So it's basically
Well,
you
he's
can't.
crazy enough. I think he might do
He
that.
probably does.
Okay. So back to Zwingli for 7 minutes. Number 27. The title Father should not be given to anyone on earth. Okay. Number 30. Those who promise chastity do wrong and foolishly take too much on themselves.
Ooh.
You know, one of the big things with, you know, these guys were pretty randy, you know. Number 31. Excommunication can only be made by the congregation corporately. In other words, there's no authority structure within the church.
That doesn't work out.
It doesn't work at all. Only those who give public offense should be excommunicated. That's interesting. 40. Only civil government can enact the death penalty.
Well, that's not entirely wrong. I mean,
No.
in Byzantium, the church never executed anybody.
Right.
The emperor killed lots of people. The church never, you know, in Western Europe, the second estate was a state within itself. They executed priests for like murder. The king didn't do it. The church did. So
Right.
they're actually right about that.
Right. And the church was executed, and then there was the Inquisition.
Yeah.
49, there is no greater scandal than that priests are not allowed to take lawful wives, but may keep mistresses if they pay a fine. We have to agree with that one, you know. 50, this is interesting. His point is God alone remits sins. Now, we would say this is a denial of the scriptures, you know, of Christ giving the authority to forgive sins to the apostles. 51, to give this authority to men takes away God's honor, and this is real idolatry. That's contrary to Christ. 52, confession to a priest should be viewed as just for seeking advice.
Good.
57, we would agree with. The true Holy Scriptures know nothing of purgatory. That's true. 58, the fate of the dead is known to God alone. In other words, no saints. Of course, we completely disagree with that. 60, prayer to God for the departed is not to be rejected, but to fix a time for this is demonic. That's weird.
So they're saying that
To fix a time to pray for the departed is, he says, is demonic.
does that mean like 40 days or something like that? Or, because it sounds like they're still saying prayer for the dead is okay.
Well, yeah, yeah, he is. Later, of course, that gets dropped. I think probably with Calvinism. And 61, the scriptures know nothing of the indelible character conferred in recent times on the priesthood. And that's interesting. That's interesting. So basically, he's rabidly anti-clerical. He was a Roman Catholic priest himself, and who had pledged celibacy and had, after messing around a bit, had renewed his vow of celibacy, and then of course he dumped it and had a girlfriend or a wife or something. If with the major leaders in the church, if it was this widespread, you know, that's a problem with lack of spiritual direction in the church. In the first millennium, you had the Roman Empire, and what did the Roman Empire do to the heretics? Okay, and so in the second millennium, especially in the West, and in the first millennium in the West, there was no overarching authority. There was the papacy, but these groups, and not only the groups themselves, but the civil context rejected the papacy. So essentially, the Protestant areas were like states or counties because the people would follow the prince of that particular county, or the duke or whatever he was, and would be in whatever church he was in, and so you had these huge areas of Northern Europe that rejected the papacy, so they were like holes in the empire, and so their legitimacy was only popular; it wasn't ecclesiastical. Obviously, the Roman Church, you know, had no patience with any of these groups.
Well, that was codified in 1648 in the Peace of Westphalia, that the prince, you know, within the Holy Roman Empire, the Protestant principalities were the ones where the prince was a Protestant, and that was the official exclusive religion in that principality, even though it was under the authority of the Catholic emperor.
Right. It was still, in other words, there was still the idea of one church, one state, or one state, one church, and an integrated, uniform religion for the whole population. There was not the idea of religious pluralism. So I have an idea. How would you like to make this into a little seminar? How'd you like to do a research paper and present your research paper?
One down.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. On the papacy?
Sure.
And the medieval role of the papacy?
Yeah.
Okay, does anybody else want to do one?
I'll help him.
Okay. The seminar, I
On
know,
various topics?
yeah,
Because I've been looking up a lot about like the established churches in the colonies and that transition to the disestablished churches, because that was a big historical thing.
it was huge, yes. And this all feeds into it because, and this chaos of the Reformation was brought to America, and it flourished here. So, okay. So who else wants to do a paper?
You're talking more of a presentation though, right?
I'm talking about a presentation.
Wow, good.
Then your dissertation.
Good than posted on my YouTube.
Yeah?
Ready to go.
We'll record it.
So,
We'll record it.
anybody else?
On anything or on this?
On anything related to
I
this?
mean, either way I'll pass, but.
You got enough papers going on right now, right? Okay, well, so,
Future reference.
okay, yeah, but how about you?
I mean, whatever you want me to do.
Do it.
Well, no, why don't you think about what would you like to write on and present to the assembled brethren? Let's specify, make it about a 5-page paper. That's not long. Have 5 or 6 sources that you're referencing, and make it a critical analysis of a topic. So this this can be fun, and you'll learn a lot by doing it this way.
No better way to learn something than to have to teach it.
Yeah, actually, in my classes that I give for both Jordanville and for the Midwest program, it's all papers. All the assignments. It's a 5-page paper a week, basically.
I like this idea, Orthodox scholars.
Let's go. We need that.
There's a lot of knowledge in this room
Yeah.
that you're tapping into.
Mhm. Yeah, and the thing is, you get to know the sources, and look them up. Follow the footnotes, and so.